Good evening, everybody. This is Steve with Real Progressives. I have a very, very wonderful treat for you all tonight. I'm going to have a friend of mine named Chris Brown join us. And I think the thing that makes Chris such a valuable guest to have for Real Progressives is that Chris is very, very fluent as a non-economist in modern monetary theory. And Chris is someone who has a tremendous amount of patience to walk people of many different belief systems into the knowledge that we've tried to talk about. I will be perfectly honest with you, I lack that patience. And Chris has always been there wherever I've gone to kind of fill the gaps, to take on all comers and to sort of just get rid of the noise and go straight for the truth. Now, what is important to know is that people try to use this against me frequently, and I don't care. It's part of my story. But I used to be a Republican, and I was a Republican for a long time. I became a Christian back in 1993. So a lot of my beliefs became very conservative for a number of years. I was born in a Republican home. I was raised to revere Reagan. I was raised to celebrate a lot of things that you and I as progressives today probably would not support. So with that in mind, I think it's important to understand that I didn't just become a progressive. It wasn't like something, that just, was bequeathed to me. It was hard fought. It came through a lot of life lessons. It came through a lot of people with patience, similar to Chris, who walked me through, who cared enough about me to let me see the truth without beating me up over the head for being some dumb, conservative, for being some dumb whatever. Now, I will tell you, it's very difficult for me sometimes to put up with people who I know have the capacity to learn, but still choose to hold on to myths and strongholds. And that right there, that belief, that inherent belief that they have, that they come to the table with, that starting point, if you will, clouds a lot of things from the start. There's a lot of factors that go into what they believe and why they believe it, which makes changing them that much more difficult. It's not just a simple factor of presenting information and then saying, well, shit, why don't you know it now? So I talked with Chris the other day, and Chris really enjoys what Real Progressives is doing. He enjoys a whole variety of things in terms of writing, in terms of going into right-wing worlds and talking to them and letting them beat him up, basically. And he says, okay, you built all these strong men. Now let's just talk about the facts. And I love that. And that's what we need in this country right now, folks. We need people to be uniting, to be working across to figure out why people feel the way they feel so that we can get to the promised land. Because progress doesn't happen in a progressive bubble. We are in a pluralistic society that requires us to understand where people are coming from. So with that, I'm going to introduce you all to my guest, Chris Brown. Chris, welcome to Real Progressive, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. That was a really nice, warm welcome. I appreciate that.
So tell me, how did you, well, you know what? Why don't we start off with who are you and how did you get on this show? Tell me why we want to hear from Chris. Tell me where you came from and where you're going.
So actually, my story is actually pretty interesting. I spent a number of years, like most people, just kind of wandering around, thinking, I had some pretty good intuitive ideas about the way the world works. And while I don't want to go too deep into this, it's really interesting because in my 20s, I'm an IT guy, first of all. So I've always been a nerd. I grew up around the Apple IIe and Amiga and Commodore, and some of you guys out there may be familiar with those old machines. And I still do that kind of work today. But in my youth, I played a lot of games. And one of the things that I was interested in was at first playing, and later on in my later 20s, I got into some design. And the hardest aspect of the game to design was the economy. Now we're talking about persistent worlds, things that go on for indefinite periods of time. Some of you in the audience may know what I'm talking about. And in my dabbling in that, I didn't really know a lot about real economies at the time, but I recognized that the important thing was not, a lot of people they think about things in more concrete terms. Things, like gold and commodities. And I understood intuitively that in order for those kinds of things to work, that there had to be enough in the game for people to do what they wanted to do. And what happened was, if there was too much or too little, that the game would suffer. So that's how I got involved, was trying to understand how to do it from a game perspective. And then after that, I sort of drifted away from that and said, well, now that I've taken 4 years to learning that aspect, I wonder how it relates to the real economy. Maybe it can give me some more insight. Well, I ended up losing my drive to do that, and was really surprised how much the real world, in some sense, is like that, in the sense that it's about keeping money in play. Too much causes inflation, too little causes unemployment. And it was really eating this stuff up, almost on a daily basis, was more and more and more. And then I met up with some really good guys. I started at a site called Debate Politics. I work with some guys, J.P. Holcomb, which you may know, Scott Donnelly, John Bisterfeld, some guys, who kind of got me interested. And from there, it just kind of took off. And to be honest with you, I probably have more time than most of those guys. And I literally do this almost on a daily basis. I literally interact. And I also have some, you were talking about my patience, right? So I tend to look at things from a very practical and pragmatic point of view, right? It doesn't matter if I'm right. What matters is how we communicate ideas with one another. And I think that's what you were talking about. So for me, it wasn't enough to know about these things. It was more about how to communicate them. So you were talking about, I spent some time at some very, very conservative sites. My goal there isn't really necessarily to prove to them that I'm right and they're wrong. It's really to understand where they're coming from. It's to understand what their arguments are. And also, too, it's a real lesson in humility for them to call me a socialist or a Marxist and tell me I don't care about the economy, and that I really just want to blow everything up and that sort of thing. So, I take all that with a grain of salt, and frankly, it's sort of an inner lesson to, be able to take all of that and keep trying to direct the conversation in a constructive manner, no matter how hard they try to drive me away from it. I just keep pushing. And I've been successful. I have engaged people who couldn't stand me, probably wouldn't put water on me if I was on fire. The nicest way to say that. And some of them have come back and said, look, I don't agree with you, but I appreciate what you've done, right? You're not telling us we're stupid. You're not telling us, you're not calling us names, even though we're calling you names. And I've had some people private message me and say, the way you're dealing with it, the way your approach, I like your approach, even if I disagree with you. I wish more liberals were like you, that sort of thing. So a little background, I don't know what else, you want to know.
Well, you're real good. So let's talk. You went into monetary theory at some point. Explain that process. How did you stumble into MMT, and what was your light bulb moment? How did that all happen?
So I like most people, pull up economics. The first book I ever read was written by Thomas Sowell, who's a very conservative writer. And I thought that some of the points that he made were very salient. Another person was Milton Friedman, and some other guys. And it was like, some of what they're saying is right, but some of it I just can't get on board with. And YouTube was a great resource. Unfortunately, there's as much bad information as there is good. Matter of fact, there's probably more bad information than there is good. But I think the key is really letting the truth shape you rather than trying to wrap the world around what you believe. You wrap yourself around, the evidence and the truths and those sorts of things. So when I would get on board with some of these guys, and suddenly I'd fall off the rails and say, you know what? When a guy like Milton Friedman says, well, you talk about how bad things are, but the poor today are better off than the poor were 100 years ago. And I go, yeah, but there's so much more potential. That can't be right. It can't be. I can't get on board with the idea that suffering is okay because it's better than it was 100 years ago. And so from there, I moved to MMT. And I think one of the first things I read was Warren Mosler, 7 Deadly Innocent Frauds, which was a great start. A little deep, but it was a good start. And then, a lot of it was just conversation. It was getting on to Introductory to Modern Monetary Theory, which was a great site. And I'm not afraid to ask questions. I'm not afraid to be wrong. I'm not afraid when somebody goes, dude, what are you talking about? That's all wrong, And so I think the hardest thing for me to grasp initially was, and maybe some listeners can attest to this, right? It's easy to think about how transactions happen at this level, right? When we talk about spending as income and that sort of thing. But how do you deal with like the Treasury and the Fed and bonds? And I don't understand all that. So I took a long time to try to understand the rudimentary aspects of that. Once I started to really grasp how that worked, all the pieces fell in place. Now, I will say this, right? The one thing that is the hardest to understand about, I think, any economic theory, but MMT included, which is I can explain inflation. I can explain things like supply and demand, and I can explain individual aspects. The biggest problem is that they overlap, right? One explanation leads to another question. And so what you find in economics especially is that there's layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of things, and you hear one and it makes intuitive sense, but then you start asking questions. Well, if that's true, what about this? And so the epiphany for me started to come when somebody would say something like Venezuela is having rampant inflation, right? And I start going, look, based on what I know, I don't even have to go read. I know that they're an export-based economy. What they're exporting just got killed. Oil. They export a lot of oil. The price of oil declined. That means the money they're pulling in declined. And I can put that together in my head now, whereas it was a lot more difficult. And look, the other thing about macroeconomics is that you ride around at sort of this 20,000 foot level, and the lower you go, the more that the waters start to mix in terms of policy and politics, right? So MMT is a description, but as you get down and down and down, it starts mixing with more policy, with more politics, and there are a lot of nuances in there. And that's the other thing I think that probably makes MMT hard for some people to swallow, is they're not at 20,000 feet. They might be at 10 or 5, or standing on the ground, and they just don't see the world that way. And you have to make sure and kind of like, look, we're looking at it from this high. And if those things are true, right? If it's true, then from there you have to work down your next step and down your next step and down your next step.
So let me ask you, the psychology dealing with different people and so forth. We talked at length about it. I'd love for you to take a few minutes and explain that to our viewers. The entire where we start from, that position point of belief more so than facts. They don't care about facts. They just have beliefs. So go for
Right.
it.
So I was telling you earlier, our what we believe drives what we perceive. I mean, that's it in a nutshell. And I really wish I had more time. This is something that really I started to come into recently, was especially with the Donald Trump thing, is facts don't matter. Why don't facts matter? What's going on? And I started to realize that, how people, there's a filter through which people perceive the world. I'm going to throw out a name. You guys should go check out a guy named Jonathan Haidt. It's spelled Haight. He's I don't know, I forget exactly what his title is. He's a little bit like Steven Pinker, if you're familiar with him. He's done some stuff on sort of morality and the brain and that sort of thing. But one of the things that Jonathan points out is the fact that when we're born, there's sort of an argument about whether or not we're a blank slate or if there's any like pre-programming. And I think there's some evidence to show that we're all born with at least, if not more, at least 5 basic traits. And they're not traits, sort of moral traits, like questions about like harm, fairness, authority, in-groups and out-groups, and purity. And what you'll find, and the interesting thing, that the research that he's done talks about how liberals, or progressives over on one side and diehard conservatives on the other value these traits differently. Liberals, obviously, I don't think I need to tell anybody in this audience, we all value the idea of freedom from harm, and we all care about fairness. And to no surprise, conservatives care about those things too, to a slightly lesser degree. But then the other 3, you have authority, in-groups and out-groups, and purity. And that's something that a lot of progressives don't see as important as the other aspects. And in fact, I think there was a survey of like 30,000 people. And by the way, you can do this from Canada, you can do it in Western Europe, Eastern Europe, you can do it in Russia, you can do it in the Middle East. It doesn't matter. It always ends up the same. Harm and fairness are at the top. Liberals tend to value those things the most, and then authority and purity and in-groups, out-groups much less. But conservatives tend to value those 3 things a little more. They kind of, on the chart, they all kind of converge. The farther you go right, the farther that those 3 aspects, the in-group, out-group, purity, and authority, those tend to be more important to conservatives. Now, knowing that, right, the big question is not how many facts we can throw across the table at the people that we disagree with. The bigger question is, how do we talk to them? How do we tell them that these ideas matter, right? And one of the suggestions I've seen is, I mean, obviously we have to couch this in terms that people agree with. As a salesperson, one of the things that I do is I go in and I talk to CEOs of large companies and I sell IT equipment. If I go in there and I tell them how fast it is and how much better it is in the last generation and how many IOPS it'll do, they'll throw me out. They don't care. All they care is how my equipment is going to save them money. Right? What are the buttons that I care about? I run a hospital, and what's important to me is how quickly we get calls and how fast we can get people from the waiting room into surgery or whatever. Those are the things I care about. Tell me in those terms why I care. Now, the reason I say that is how do we couch things in terms that people that disagree with us, how will the things that we care about affect them? What's the story we can tell? How do we relate to those people? And that's really a lot of what I try to do as a I don't know, kind of as a philosophy, right? Is not just to spew facts and then argue them and tell them they're dumb. It's to address them, and then try to find, well, somebody said it there, common ground. I'm going to take that. I think that's a really good place is to start there. But I think the other problem is at the extremes, people are so they want to put you in a box. That's what I find personally, right? Is, oh, you're a liberal? Well, then you believe in Marxism and you believe in socialism. I'm like, no, I mean, why? And so it's trying to talk them back off of that. So that's I think the big challenge, and that's one of the things that I try to do. Right? Is try to treat everybody like they're human. Not make anybody feel bad for asking a question, because that's what we need more of.
Right. And see, I have a problem. For me, where I have a problem typically is when people that are talking beyond their knowledge level try to talk authoritatively and they don't ask questions. When they come from a full cup status and they're not really in the mode of exchanging and listening, they assume they know. They say the Rothschilds, and it's like, when did you meet these Rothschilds people? What did they do to you to make you hate them so? Not that they're not good or bad or anything like that. The point is, I want to know why they're so beholden to killing this one boogeyman as opposed to looking at the big picture. And it's just a struggle for me.
So I think the answer to that question, and now I'm going really kind of off the reservation here, but in my, and again, I've spent time on flat Earth sites. I've spent time on moon landing hoax sites. And one of the things that I saw an insight that somebody else had written, I won't take credit for this, but they said that one of the things that people do when they embrace, especially conspiracy theories, is the idea that they really do lack the true understanding. And so they create one. And when you create one, what's better than thinking that you're the one person, or you belong to a very small group of people that understand something that everybody doesn't, right? So that John F. Kennedy was shot for X, Y, and Z reason, but most people think it was, Oswald. He was a patsy, or the moon landings were faked, or the Earth is really flat. I mean, look, make fun of flat earthers all you want, but these guys have some of the most incredible explanations. Wrong, they're absolutely wrong, but they are so detailed in their bad explanations. And so, why do people get like that? Why do they grab onto that? I think it's because they lack the desire or ability to value facts, and instead are more interested in being right in their own world, and they develop very intricate ways to explain things. And so, to your point, when you talk about guys about the Rothschilds and stuff, I ask questions. I just start asking them questions, and I start trying to lead them. I kind of let their answers try to lead them. Now, a lot of times they won't answer. A lot of times they're ignored. Yeah, I can't reach out to that person. I can't help them. But there are some people that will engage. I'm in a YouTube conversation right now with somebody who at first derided me and made fun of me, and now he's asking me a lot of questions, and I just keep answering them. And frankly, I don't care if he believes me or not, because other people are going to read that, and they don't have that emotional, they're not invested in that conversation. And so a lot of times, my hope is that there's a group of people out there that are reading this going, that does make some sense. There's some really good work too on social conformity. If you haven't seen it, YouTube Candid Camera in the Elevator, and you'll know what I'm talking about. The show is like two people get on an elevator, or let's see, the elevator opens, there are two people in it, and they're facing the back. And somebody gets on, and they're standing looking at the front, and they feel that social conformity. They have to turn around with everybody else. And of course, everybody in the audience is laughing watching this. But social conformity is a big part of that. Now, there was an experiment done where you put a group of people in a room and you show them something that's dead obvious, and you ask them to choose between three options, and the B is the obvious answer, but everybody in the room clicks A. And to some degree, people will often follow the group. What's really interesting about the experiment is you only need one dissenter. You only need one person to change the conversation for you to go back to the right answer. So if there are 10 people in a room and 9 people guess wrong, 80% of the time, you'll guess wrong with them. But if one of those 9 dissents with you, if you can see them dissent, you will also dissent to a much higher degree. So a lot of this, again, is about psychology. It's about how we affect, people, allow them that space to dissent. So I think that's what I do, is I try not to attack people. Rather, I desperately try to engage them and get them talking, because I want the other people to see that in the background. And I want them to read it, and I want them to feel okay to dissent. And that's a lot of what I try to do.
So I take a slightly different approach, which is probably the reason why my ceiling gets hit pretty easily. But for me, my concern is that, like with economics, for example, people are literally dying from austerity. The world is falling apart right now in so many ways because of a fake belief that we're $20 trillion in debt. How can we spend? We got to cut. Do better. You better behave better, live better, do better, whatever better, because we can't spend on you lazy bastards anymore, sitting on your porch doing this, using your Obama phone, eating, caviar on the Snap card and all this other crap. And all this lies are killing people. So for me, my approach has been, hey guys, there's an economic model that we're failing on, but it's in play today. And damn it, if you don't figure it out, you're literally a murderer by proxy, whether you realize it or not. You may be doing it involuntarily. You may not even realize you're doing it. But when you pitch austerity, you're killing somebody each and every day. Because I think I can't remember, it's 40,000 people die for every 1% of unemployment or something to that effect. I mean, people die. And so for me, it's like, well, you're entitled to your opinion, but your opinion's lethal, and you're entitled to know that it's lethal. And that probably causes some people's hackles to go up. But the reality is that economics, which is what I typically talk about to most people, is like watching paint dry. You know what I mean? Right. So the idea has been that I brought the MMA death match to economics, which brings people to the table to watch the fight. I'm like the Fight Club of economics. Now, there are times that I take a different tact in it, and it's beautiful to watch people like you come around. You see the scattered wreckage, and you start cleaning up, and you see some people that are willing vessels, and you go through and you take care of it.
So I'm kind of the Joel Osteen of economics, right? I mean, I tend to talk about the things that we can accomplish. Certainly the world needs people like you kind of waking them up. I think the world needs people like me to, again, I try, I'm a very visual person. I try to put things in very intuitive, try to talk more intuitively, very visually, and then just start one block at a time, man. You probably saw my post the day on inflation, and I think that's one of the things that people have the hardest time with, is this assumption that if you spend more money in the economy, you create inflation. And it's a real eye opener once you realize that what inflation really is and what causes it. So, I don't want to oversimplify it, right? Because there are lots of different ways that you can, frame inflation, but really what we're talking about is government spending, right? How much can the government spend? How much is too much? I call it the constraint. I ask the question, what is the constraint on spending? I think the first really intuitive thing to note is that if too much spending causes inflation, then too little will cause deflation. Now that you know that, now that you have two sides, deflation over here and inflation over here, the question is where are we at? There is some medium point, right? And the question is, are we at that point right now? Are we literally on the cusp of inflation. And if we're not, then we can spend more. Or if we are, then we can't spend it. But the question is, when I put to my conservative friends who say, government spending is inflationary, my question, first I frame it that way. The way I framed it on the web the other day was to say something like, if the government wanted to build a bullet train from LA to New York, why, I might ask a conservative friend, why can't we do that? And his answer might be, well, we can't afford it. And then I remind him that the government can literally create all the currency it wants. And if that's true, and it is, then it's not a question of afford. Well, okay, it'll cause inflation. But if inflation driven by demand, if inflation driven by dollars spent is about raising or causing the demand for things to exceed the supply, are you telling me that we can't build a train without causing permanent long-term shortages in our economy? I mean, really? And so then I go, well, it's not okay. So, I mean, if you tried to build a bullet train, spend $1 trillion on this super fast train and do it in a year, yes, it would cause inflation because it would take a lot of people to do it. But on the other hand, if you did it in a very planned way, there's plenty of labor in the workforce, and a lot of people don't know the statistics. I mean, today they tell us it's 4.9%. I think it's a little bit higher than that if you include people who are underemployed, right? Guy making $80,000 gets laid off and takes a job for 40 because that's all he can find. And then there are people that just aren't looking for work. And we're not talking about, once we exclude the people that what I call, shouldn't work, they can be volunteers, they can be the students, they can be people who are retired. Those people, we don't want them to work, right? So once we exclude all those, I'm not even including them. I'm just talking about capable people who are capable of work. And so anyway, my point is I think Stephanie Kelton estimated that to be somewhere around 23 million, and that was probably about, I don't know, a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago. So if it's true that there are 23 million people that are unemployed, then the statistics are a little bit off. But of course, the government only calculates people that are actively looking for work, and they have a very rigid explanation of what that is. So anyway, once you know that there are people out there, then the question then becomes, do we have enough raw materials? Of course we do. And this is America. Our population relative to land size is reasonably small compared to places like India or whatever. So I don't think that raw materials is any kind of hindrance or constraint. So then the question is, how do we get the people from where they are into these jobs? And that's a whole nother conversation. But the point is that if there is labor and there is raw materials, then spending on something like a bullet train wouldn't cause inflation as long as it doesn't cause long-term shortages in either labor or raw materials. And even if it did, let's say it did, let's say the government buys this train and it causes a shortage of concrete or a shortage of steel. Those kinds of shortages create opportunities for companies to meet that new level of demand. So there is inflation that's driven by external factors like, let's say, taxes. If the government raised taxes to a really high level, no amount of supply can meet that in terms of, it's not a demand supply problem. But if we run out of steel or if we run out of concrete, then it's just a question of getting more people into the economy to create those things. I think this is probably largely what happened with energy over the last 10 or 15 years, in that the price rose, and when the price rises, the barriers to entry to go after energy sources that are out there, like gas and tar sands, and no matter what we think about those things, those opportunities were always there. People have known about them for a long time. The challenge was to bring profit to it. And so driving inflation in that particular industry really lowered the barrier for demand because there was more profit. And what happened is now we have lots of capital equipment that was purchased, lots of people that were employed by that sector of the economy, and they drove a supply back up to meet relative demand. And what we ended up with was gas prices came back down. But that model can be applied across the entire economy. The question is, the real constraint isn't cash, right? We can create all the cash we want. The challenge is to make sure that whatever cash we create, once it's put into the economy, has somewhere to go, right? It has, in other words, the things of real value are there to purchase once the cash is created, and that's really the challenge.
So let me ask you a question.
Huh?
Our viewers are obviously very progressive. They followed Bernie Sanders. They followed Jill Stein. Some of them have gone even further left into different various smaller sects. My question to you is this. We're actively fighting for things like single-payer health care. We're actively fighting for green energy today, not in 50 years, but today. We're actively fighting to end poverty. We're actively fighting to have free college for all. Things that seem to fly in the face of not only conservative thinking, but typical vote blue Democrat thinking, because they still have this Calvinism in them that thinks you got to earn everything. They don't realize
no free lunch.
They're hurting the economy. So can you talk from so our people, our audience has some sort of a blueprint for taking these ideals and then bridging the gap to explain, because we're activists. We're not just, having a casual conversation. We're trying to change the world. So with that in mind, as we leave our cocoon of progressivism, how do we take these very important ideas that we believe are worth fighting for, and then in turn branch out into places like a Trump supporter or like a Hillary supporter that believed that Bernie's plans were pie in the sky, another neoliberal thing, pie in the sky, right? How do we take and bridge those divides? Talk to me a little bit about that, because I think that's what these guys want to know more about.
So, wow, that's a deep and difficult question, right? And it's funny because people ask me all the time what my politics is, and I tend to be very pragmatic, right? I try not to embrace things for the sake of embracing them, right? It feels really good to be in a group of people who are all in stark agreement, but then what happens is you get in those groups and it gets hard to get out, right? It's difficult to dissent. So I really try to keep those people, everybody, at arm's length and embrace the good ideas and call out the bad ones. But let's see, I'm trying to think of how to answer your question. So from my point of view, I think that, this is why I'm so passionate about MMT, because it allows me, in some sense, it allows me to be politics free, right? Because I believe that anything worth accomplishing can only be accomplished if at least in our society, right, it takes money to do it. And if you don't understand money, you don't understand how it works, if you don't understand that it's out there, what the real constraints are, and how the banking system works, if you don't understand that stuff, then what's going to happen when you advocate for green energy? The first question is, it's a waste of money, or we can't afford it, and the reality really is, once you learn the economics of it, it may end up in the long run being the thing that saves us, right? Because we're being told. Take global warming. While I absolutely totally believe that not only global warming is a real thing, but it's human induced. There's no doubt in my mind, right? And I try not to be a cynic, right? My glass is always half full. So what I see in global warming is, yes, the world is going to change. And at this point, I'm not real hopeful that we'll be able to stop it. Like the hole in the ozone layer, 25 years ago, that seems to have we put the brakes on that in time. I'm not so sure we're here with this. So the next question is, what's the next step? Well, once we understand money, we understand that we have the power and the capacity and the productivity in America to meet a lot of these challenges. I mean, personally, I think, and again, I'm no scientist. There are lots of people out there that can correct me on this, but I think if I feared anything, it would be that farmland today becomes unfarmable 25, 30, 50 years from now. And you can't just make new farmland. If it starts raining in the desert tomorrow and it stops raining in the Midwest, on the same day, it's going to be 10,000 years before you can farm that desert. So the question is, how do you deal with a problem like that? Well, hydroponics might be a solution. Well, that takes money. You can't even get into the solutions until you understand how socially you're going to get people together to deal with those problems. Again, be it global warming, be it alternative energy or whatever. So from my perspective, it's really understanding how when you're having the conversation, the first hurdle you're going to get to is we can afford it. And understanding that probably can. I mean, I can't speak for everything, right? There are real constraints in the world. But once you understand what those are and where to look for them, for example, today the Fed reports that capacity utilization in our economy in terms of our maximum capacity versus what we're using, what I'm trying to think of, industrial capacity. I think we're at something like 75%. Now, if I look back in history, I think the 30-year high was 10 points higher, and the average is 5 points higher. So we should be at least 80%, if not 85%. And I think historically, if you go back to World War II, we were at something like 92% capacity utilization. And what that means is if there are trucks, trailers sitting in the yard of a company that delivers things, those trailers, when they lose capacity, that's because there's a problem with demand. And you'll see this everywhere you go. You look at office buildings that have empty floors. You look at, trucks that are parked and aren't used. You look at, places that are downsizing. So the first question is, once we understand how all that works, then that's the first step to getting where you're talking about, which is I want to advocate these things. And you got to get past that first hurdle. And then it seems to me that it really becomes a much easier question to handle. Then it isn't a question of can we do it? It's what do we do, right? Do we develop solar? Do we develop wind? Do we develop nuclear? So I hope that answers your question.
It does. Let me ask you another question, because obviously the idea of debt in our society is being propped up by the right wing and the center right wing, which would be the Democrats as well, as the most important thing we could ever be worried about. The debt. We got to cut the debt. We got to cut the deficit. Can you talk a little bit about that? Most of our viewers have heard some of this before, but I think you have a really nice way of explaining debt and deficits in that 30,000 foot level kind of way. Would you mind taking a stab at that?
Sure. The first thing I do is do my best Jean-Luc Picard. And then say, look, you had Ellis on the other night. I can't think of anybody better to explain it than him, but I'll take a shot at it. So, the first question you have to ask yourself is, do taxes, because it's sort of born out of this idea that taxes pay for things. And I think the first thing you have to ask yourself, and when I tell somebody, look, taxes don't, at the federal level, now, not at the state level, at the federal level, taxes don't actually pay for things. And people go, well, that doesn't make any sense. And I said, all right, think about it like this. I try to use Monopoly as an example because most people have played Monopoly at one point in their life. And my first question to them is, what is the first thing you do after the board is set up, right? The board's out, the players are sitting there. What's the first thing you do in Monopoly? You pass out cash, right? The game doesn't collect cash from you. You have to pass the cash out. Without the cash, without people having money in their hands, they can't buy anything. They can't pay taxes. There are cards in there that have penalties on them. There are spaces you land on, you pay taxes. You don't go around the board and pay the taxes first, right? You start out with the money. And then every time you pass go, you get free money. Why? Because what can be purchased on the board can't be purchased unless there's money in everybody's hands. So the idea is that, the debt represents some, failing. I mean, look, there are a couple ways to approach this. One way is to say, look, the debt is made up of treasuries, and the treasuries are held by people, the government, and foreign interests. And when you break that down, it's about a third. So we actually, the citizens of the United States and companies of the United States, they actually own some of this. So when we're paying the debt, we're really paying ourselves in some sense. The government owns the other third. Well, I think in 1983, I believe it was, the government decided that it should start saving for Social Security. And so it started buying its own treasuries as a way to save. If there is ever an idea that was just so ridiculous, let me put it this way, it'd be the equivalent of taking a credit card, borrowing money from it, and putting it in a savings account to earn interest, and then using it all to pay the credit card back. I mean, that's how ridiculous it is. But in the sorry, there's some commotion here in the background. Anyway, so the debt is really just a measure of economic activity, right? And so just like in Monopoly, every dollar that comes out of the bank is, if you thought about it, that is the debt. That's the bank's debt. It's the player's income, and it's the money they use amongst one another. But every dollar that comes out of that Monopoly bank would be equivalent to the real debt. I mean, that's what it is. And so the idea that Monopoly players would suddenly go, the bank's debt's really high. Don't you think we should pay it back? Well, if the board was filled with cards and pieces and hotels, what you would find is you would pull those out and you would pay the debt back to the bank, and then suddenly the players would have no cash. And when they started landing on each other's spaces, they would have to start mortgaging off all of their cards and so forth. It's selling back their hotels. I mean, it's a balance between the amount of productivity in the economy and the amount of money in the economy. If you take the money out, you by default, by accounting identity, the productivity also declines. And so what's happened in America, what's really interesting is that, and I think Steve Keen really hits on this point really well, is as the government embraces this idea of too much debt and cutting back, the private sector has picked up the slack. I said to somebody the other day, if you support growth, or if the economy moves forward and you cut the debt, the public debt, then you buy accounting identity. In order to grow, then the private sector has to borrow, right? I mean, you can't grow without money, right? I mean, there are other factors like velocity, but those things are they sit in pretty tight ranges. So the point being that, let me gather my thoughts again. Is that, I know what I was going to say. I was going to say that as the public increases its debt, I'll tell you what, let me step back here for 1 second. If you look at the amount of interest that we pay on the debt as a percentage of GDP, you'll notice that from 1940 till today, it's fallen within a range between 0.8 and 3.1%. That's a pretty small range, and that's not very much. Today, it's at 1.2%. So that percentage, as a percentage of GDP, is not growing. What is growing is the amount of private debt in proportion to GDP, and that's been rising steadily. And the reason that matters is because people have real constraints, right? You have your salary, I have my salary. If I make $50,000 a year, then a certain portion of that, right, I spend. And if I spend 25% of what I make on debt, and 10 years from now I spend 50%, paying on that debt is paying on past productivity. It doesn't do anything to help productivity today. And what's happened is, I don't know the number right off the top of my head. I think we're, what, 200% of GDP in terms of, I could be wrong about that. Somebody out there correct me. But I know that the percentage is pretty high. And what's happening is, if wages don't keep pace with that rise in private sector debt, which I think is the case, then what you get is higher and higher percentages of people's income is going to pay for past productivity, which is driving down demand. And in the private sector, the response has been to consolidate money, has been to do stock buybacks and move things into the financial economy. And I think that's a big reason why we're not seeing, we're not seeing the demand that we'd expect, right? I mean, the top 20% can't employ the bottom 80%. One of the statistics I threw out to you the other day was, in 1980, non-home wealth, right? If you take the house out of it, then non-home wealth was something like, the bottom 80% controlled, I'm trying to remember these statistics off the top of my head, 8.1, 8.7, something like that. And today it's 4.7. So the bottom 80% has lost a large share of the wealth. And interestingly, right, we're really embraced on this idea that the 1% is screwing us. The truth is that if you look at the statistics, it's the top, I think 90th to 99th percentile has had like a 7% jump. And that really scares me, because, the top 1% represents what, 3 million families? The top 10%. Yeah, the top 10% represents 30 million families. And the way that they spend and the things that they do, I think, really affect the rest of the economy. We were talking about it when I was a kid. We shopped at Bradley's and Zayre's and wherever you live. There were a lot of Sears, Montgomery Ward, those kinds of stores were out there. And it wasn't normal to walk into a mall and see a $7,000 fur coat in the door. If you wanted to go see that, you had to go into DC or New York or, Rodeo Drive. And now you get those things in more rural areas, because there's much larger number of people that have a much higher level of wealth and income.
So hold on for a second. So as usual, we have the people that think intuitively, shouldn't the federal government pay down its debt? And they don't understand that debt at the federal level is not debt at all, like what we know it. And I think that that's a really bad term. We should throw the word debt out, but debt is kind of an accounting term. Unfortunately, it should be considered like a national savings account, so to speak. It's our national resources, whatever you want to call it. Dual entry accounting says that if there is a debt over here, there's an asset over here, or a deficit, et cetera. Can you talk a little bit about why it's absolutely like a government must be in debt? Like, we must have more money out, than we take in, or what happens? I mean, to me, it drives me crazy, but that's because I've been saying it so much. You got a fresh shot at talking about it.
All right, so I'm going to try something, and we'll see if this works. Because I'm a visual person, I know some of you out there are. I'm going to try this, okay? So I'm going to move move this over here, and sorry about the light if it's not very bright. Hopefully you guys can see my whiteboard. I'm going to get rid of this because I don't need this. Where is my... So, can you see it all right? Can you see that whiteboard okay?
Indeed.
All right. So, let's break this into... This is double entry accounting, and let's see if I can do this under this much pressure. Okay. So, we have the government... I'll tell you what, let me make this a little bigger because I know it's probably hard for you guys to see. So let me see if I can make this as big as possible. Is that all in the frame? So we have the government here. I'm going to use the Fed. I'm going to put the Fed in the middle. And the reason I'm going to do that is because today it is a lot different, but I'm just trying to get across a basic concept here. So for those MMT folks who know what I'm talking about, I'm using the Fed because I'm really trying to oversimplify this, okay? And then I'm going to put PS for private sector, okay? And then we have liabilities and assets, liabilities and assets, liabilities and assets, okay? And so what happens is, let's say the government wants to buy something of some value, okay? It creates, today the way it works, it doesn't have to work this way, but the way we do it now is the government creates a bond. So let's say let's say the government wants to buy, I don't know, help me out here, a battleship, okay? We don't even use battleships anymore, but let's just pretend the government wants to buy a battleship. So what the government does is it's a liability, a debt, right? That is a bond. Okay, so it creates the bond, and then it sells that bond. Now today it sells it to, and this is, by the way, somewhere I could probably use a little more education myself. So again, I'm gonna really dumb this down, but basically it goes to, let's say, the Fed, and the Fed gets the bond as an asset. Okay, so the government has a bond, it's minus bond, the Fed is plus a bond. Now the Fed will create a liability in the cash. So it creates cash, and then it transfers the cash into the private sector, and the private sector now holds the cash as an asset. And then the private sector will now go minus a battleship. Okay, I'll just write bat, okay? And it obviously this is made of real resources and labor. In order to get to build this, you need resources and labor, okay? And then what it does is it transfers that back to the government, which now has an asset in the battleship. So if you read this, it's the bond creates the cash, which is then transferred to the private sector, which then builds something of real value and then transfers that back. And now the government has something of real value. But if you look at this, in order to get from here to here, right, the debt had to be created. This is the debt. The $20 trillion that we owe is a measure of this. And it's also reflected in this. This is the private sector over here. Okay, this is the private sector. It has cash. The government has bonds. If you back this up and do it the other way, if you use this to pay back this, if you take the cash and you pay back this, you just unwind all of this. But the reality is, at the end of the day, if you draw a line down here, this minus this equals 0. This minus this equals 0. This minus this equals 0. You don't owe anything, right? The level is 0. This is what it is. If you unwind this, and look, it's a lot more. I'm gonna move back over here now. Hopefully let's see, I'll get that in frame. Hopefully that makes some sense. But at the end of the day, the reality is that in order to get to that point, and look, there are a lot more steps, right? There are primary dealers, and the Treasury gets involved. I was trying to keep it at really a high level, but at the end of the day, in order to get from the government bond to the real asset, it sort of swings through the system and it all equals 0. The Fed's assets and its liabilities, the government's assets and its liabilities, the private sector's assets and its liabilities, and they're different, but they all equal 0. 0. At the end of the day, that's how it all works.
So Randy, Ellis, and others, we don't have to sell bonds at all to do this, because bonds are just like an accounting measure.
Just an anachronism, right?
But the people are so stuck on the idea that the government has to sell bonds to fund things so we can buy things. And the reality is that these are like just savings accounts at the Fed. We're not talking about debt like we know it. We're the creator of the dollar. The dollar that we created is the one that came into the body. I mean, we're not talking about we need money from people so that we can buy these things. That's the most important thing I want people to understand, is this is an accounting tactic. It's not a reality tactic. We are the creator of the dollar.
So my understanding, and there are probably people out there that could correct me on this, but the way I understand it is that when we went off the gold standard, right, it wasn't computer time, right? We were still doing everything in books, and there were still, a lot of that stuff was still kept by hand. And I don't think the government could reinvent the wheel in that system. And so what they did was they just swapped gold as an asset for bonds, and the book stayed pretty much the same, right? We really just made a minor tweak. Now, I think the downside is, and the interesting side of that is that it was almost so easy that academia missed it, right? They really didn't teach it, right? Because it just felt like nothing really had changed. And they didn't realize that really things had been turned around 180 degrees. Back in the day, in order for a bank to lend, it had to have savings to lend from. It had to have real assets. Today, it's exactly the opposite, right? Banks can create money out of thin air. The bank's constraint isn't the amount of money that it has in reserves. The bank's constraint is credit-worthy borrowers, and the level of regulation that's out there. So, that, I think once you start to learn those things, I think everything starts to fall into place. Now, to your point, right, when you talk about we don't need bonds, this story back here, I think it's easier to grasp than the idea of tossing them out, in the sense that, when I say this equals this and this equals this and that makes sense, and people go, oh, yeah, okay. I'm probably not the best person to talk about how to move past that. I know, that's something that I thought Ellis addressed really well, and I wouldn't try to outdo Ellis in that regard. I've also listened to some the stuff that Warren Mosler and Randall Ray have talked about in that sense, and I don't think I'm going to tackle that. But no, we don't need bonds, because at the end of the day, the government creates the currency. And so really the government, if you think about it, the economy is like a pool, right? And there are lots of visual references online. Right. There are lots of visual references online for this. But if the economy is a pool and there's a drain at the bottom, and the drain represents taxes, and there's a hose that's putting water into the pool, I think if you told a 4-year-old that when you drain the pool out, that's where the water for the hose comes from. That's what we think, is that the drain and the faucet are connected, that these two things are connected, and they're not, right? We can drain off and supply in at different rates, and they have nothing to do with one another. So the challenge is, if the economy is a pool and the water represents the amount of money relative to the amount of utilization, in other words, the closer the pool gets to the top, the more people are working, then the government it taxes a way to prevent inflation. But if you think about it, right, kind of think about it like, I'm trying to think of an intuitive way to describe this, right? So if taxes are a bucket and you dip the bucket into the pool, you've now made that bucket's worth of room in the pool, right? And actually it goes the other way around. So we spend first and then we tax later. And that really matters. I mean, that's really important to understand, that spending comes first and then taxes. And again, the explanation from that goes right back to the beginning. If the government were brand new today and it hadn't spent a single dollar yet, you have to spend first before you can tax. The monopoly example, you have to pass out the money first before you can buy anything. Now, somebody just asked, why start with bonds? And the answer is because that's where money creation comes from, right? The government, bonds and cash are two forms of the same thing. As Ellis would put it, one is a savings account at the Fed and one is a checking account at the Fed. And you just move them back and forth. That's really all you're doing. So when the government wants to create new money, I think this is referred to as sort of the difference between horizontal money and vertical money, or endogenous and exogenous money. The idea is that when you borrow money to buy a car, you're not adding any money to the economy. You're creating an asset and a liability. And that, in the overall scheme of things, that equals zero, right? Because when you go to the bank and you take the loan, the bank creates $30,000 from thin air, and it marks up your account. and then it holds the contract is its asset, because the contract is worth slightly more than you borrowed when you consider interest, right? And so, but when you add those things up, they actually come out to less than nothing. But please don't get tied up in that, because a lot of people say, well, interest is the problem. Well, interest isn't really a problem at all, because I'll give you guys a quick. I know I'm getting off track here. You could pay $5 in interest with only $1 in the economy. So if you think about it, Steve, if I borrow $1 from you and I promise to pay back $5, but there's only $1 in the economy, what's really important is the amount of time I have and whether or not you'll give me the opportunity to earn the $1 back. So I borrow the $1, I come back to you the first month and I hand it to you and I say, okay, here's your first month's payment. Now I owe you $4. Now, would you like me to wash your car? Oh, you would? Would you do it for $1? And you say, sure. So I wash your car, you hand me the $1, I hand it back. Now I owe you $3. So that's how you pay interest. It really relies on circulation of money. And by the way, that's one of the big problems we have today, right? Is so many people holding so much money outside the economy. So that's another reason to advocate for, it doesn't have to be taxes, right? It can be investment. If we don't want to tax the wealthy, we do want to encourage them to invest in society, because when they invest, that gives us an opportunity to recapture that wealth and then pay them back, right? They spend it in, we earn it, and we say, we owe you guys, you capital holders, you banks, whatever, you let me earn it back and I'll pay it back, and it's a cycle. And what happens is, I think today, is that cycle has been largely broken, a lot of that. And so what the government has to do, and by the way, we'd call this in MMT, we'd call this a desire to save, right? The wealthy have a desire to save. So the pool, if you think about it, it's almost like some of that water is locked up. It's off to the side and it's not mingling with the other water. And so we need to add more, right? We need to put more in to make sure that the middle class, the rest of us, have money to deal with. We have money to spend and trade and do it, things that need to be done. And if the wealthy suddenly start spending that money and everybody goes, inflation, the government has the ability to tax, right? The tax, they can open the drain and start lowering the level and making sure that the pool doesn't overflow and it doesn't get too low. I mean, that's really the challenge, is just keeping the right number of totals.
Stephanie Kelton, Alice said this. The best way to prove to the wealthy that we don't need them is to spend. We'll tax you later. I'm not worried about that. We got people dying today.
Right.
So from my perspective, what you're saying makes perfect sense in an organism that's functioning properly. The problem is the organism isn't functioning properly. The economy is dying even with all this money in it. It's dying because it's not being equitably distributed, so to speak. The rules of the game are truly stacked against the regular guy, and we end up fighting amongst each other for the table scraps left over. And the idea
here. So wait a minute. So let me stop you right there before I lose my train of thought. Sure. So here's my explanation for all that is, we'll go back to the 70s. We'll go back from the swap to the gold standard to the fiat standard. We realize today that there was a huge gap in knowledge. Academia didn't pass it along. I mean, it's still being taught in textbooks. I know professors that are teaching this stuff like, what do you call it? I can't think of it right off the top of my head. Where banks have to have reserves. Help me out here, Steve. Banks have to have reserves in order to make loans. I believe I can't think of it.
The fractional reserve and all the other nonsense.
Thank you. So, I mean, I know guys that are teaching that are professors, and they go, look, I know it's wrong, but it's in the book, and this is the way they tell us to teach it. And of course, I pull people aside and I teach it, and then I go, but by the way, it doesn't really work like this anymore. It's crazy. So, I mean, we have to attack. I think the first step is really to fix academia. I think the second step is to recognize the fact that we're doing what you're doing, which is educating people, because those people are voting for people who believe like they do. So when we talk about how stupid Washington is, we have to remember that they were voted in by people who believe what they do. They're doing exactly what their constituents want them to do. And so the next step is forget the presidency. You know, the Republicans took the Congress, man. They took it. And we have to take it back. And we have to convince people on the street that, you know, the way we're doing economics is wrong. And I think that's really the next step, is educating people. And that's why it's my politics, man. This is why I do it, is, you know, I go out there and I try to teach people a different. I was at a party the other night at my neighbor's house for Christmas Eve, and subject came up and I started talking. I was there for 4 hours, and people are like, wow, that, you know, and when you can be face to face and it doesn't become an online pissing match, I think people get a lot more engaged. And that's one of the things that I want to do, is get out there and have more face to face meetings and let people ask me face to face how this stuff works, because people are a lot more civil in person. And really that's my goal long term, is to do what you're doing, but strictly at an economic level, just helping people understand this stuff. And then my hope is that whether you're a conservative or a progressive or a libertarian, well, I can't count much for libertarians because I think they're mostly built around I'm not making fun of libertarians. I'm not. I just think that a lot of their social and political views are built around an economic idea, and they're really hard to pull off of that. But I think there are a lot of conservatives out there who don't base their beliefs around an economic core. They advocate for something called economic responsibility, but they don't even know what that means, right? So we have to help them understand, you know, how to change we're changing the conversation and help them understand how money really works. And, you know, there's always going to be that 30% out there that's just never going to agree with you. But I really think that there are a lot of moderate people out there who embrace the idea. I mean, I was one of those people 10 years ago who said, I want to be responsible. We all want to be responsible. And spending money that we quote unquote don't have feels irresponsible. When you read how much debt there is, it feels irresponsible. So then we just have to, right. So we have to free them by helping them understand what those numbers really represent, right? The government and the private sector are not one, they are separate. And, you know, you have flows between them, and the government can do things that the private sector can't. I mean, that's just the economic reality.
It's a currency issue. All right, let me ask you one final question before we close this out. Okay. My greatest fear is coming closer and closer to possible fruition, and that is the idea of the GOP getting enough state houses to call for a constitutional convention. There seems to be near bipartisan support for a balanced budget amendment at the federal level. That would be economic suicide, in my opinion. It would be economic terrorism and treason. I'm sure you'd use less flavorful language. However, what is your take on a balanced budget amendment, and why is it not good?
But look, when I rank my fears, there's nuclear war and then there's balanced budget. And seriously, number 2, because, and I think Ellis said it on his show the other night, he was talking about the fact that we have a trade deficit and we're sending a lot of money offshore, right? So Stephanie Kelton said, don't balance the budget, balance the economy, right? It's about inflows and outflows. There isn't one faucet into the economy in the sense that there's government spending. There are at least 3. There's investment, there's government spending, and there's, what's the last one? Government spending, investment.
I always say private debt, public debt, and rest of world is how I view the sectoral balances.
Right. And so, but what I'm saying is there are 3 that add and 3 that take away. So there's government spending, there's, exports. That's what I was trying to think of. Government spending, exports, and investment. Those things add. And then when you take the things that take away, which are taxes, imports, and I keep forgetting the last one. Taxes, imports, help me out here.
Unemployment?
No. All right. So it's taxes, unemployment. Now you got me going. So you got taxes, you've got the opposite, investment, savings. Thank you. So there's savings, there's taxes, and there's imports. So when you take these 3 factors, when you take these three very real things and you just add them up, just fill in the numbers. If they equal less than zero, then there is money draining out of the economy. And now I go back to what I said before. We've had this problem. I actually have put together a spreadsheet that showed what happened from 1996 running all the way up to 2016. And when we ran a surplus as a nation, what we were doing was the T side was exceeding the G, right? The G is government spending and T is taxes. We had more taxes than we had government spending. And then when you go to imports, exports, we import way more stuff. We're importing real goods and services, and we're sending out our money, right? We're exporting our cash, and we're importing goods and services. Whereas in exports, we're exporting goods and services, and we're importing cash. The problem is that it's so out of whack. And not that that is a problem. It's only a problem if the government doesn't replace the loss with new cash. So what I'm saying is the only way that that works, and back to the point was, why is a balanced budget bad? Because a balanced budget locks G and T. The only two things that the government has any real control over, any sizable control over, is how much they spend and how much they tax. And the S and the I, the savings and investment, the government doesn't really determine those levels. Imports and exports, government doesn't really determine those levels, but the government does determine spending and taxes. And I'm telling you, if you lock the two in balance, you would get an economic imbalance. Off the top of my head, I would say savings and investments kind of a hard number to nail down, but imports versus exports is 800 billion. So right there.
Destroy us.
Right. So I would seriously consider moving out of the country if that happened. Although I'm not sure it would matter, because it would flow to China. It would destroy their economy, right? Their economy is depending on us to buy that stuff. And if you balance the budget, we would suddenly have a lot less money to make purchases. $1 out of every $4 the government spends, $1 out of every $4 spent into the economy is spent by the government. If you balance the budget, then you wouldn't have the deficit anymore, and you would have a lot less spending. And then what you get is a whole lot of people out of work. I guarantee, I would be surprised if the economy could last 2 years under a balanced budget.
In your world, you would be a lot more gentle than this. But to me, I'm the alarm clock. I'm saying, guys, if you're advocating for a balanced budget amendment, if you're into cutting spending, you're killing people. You're a murderer by proxy. That's what I approach them with. And I want them angry at me. I want them to go, no, I'm not. Of course I'm not. And then I lay it out there, and they're like, oh my God, I have blood on my hands. I want them to feel that, because it's that serious to me.
All right, so I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna do this one more time, right, before we get off here, because Ronnie asked a question, and I think sometimes if you see it written down, it makes more sense. Now, I have some real numbers, but I don't want to take too much time. Let's just look at this, right? Yeah. So, government spending. Let's see, how are we going to do this? Okay, so government spending plus taxes, minus taxes plus imports minus exports plus, I don't know if I'm still on the board here or not.
You're good.
Savings plus investment. Okay, so all you have to do is take these in, and to Ronnie's question, it is I think you asked something like, was it the trade deficit, or however you asked it, and the fact of the matter is generally here over the last, if you go back to 2009, this and off the top of my head, and let me see if I can do this. I think in 2009, the deficit, if you took these two and you subtracted them, it was plus, I don't know, somewhere around like 900 billion or a trillion. Then it dropped to like 700. Then the next year it was like, I forget, like 6, and then 5. And then last year, I think it went down to like 439. And we were actually, when this number drops, when the deficit drops to something like less than 3% of GDP, we flirt with recession. Historically, we've hit recession. And I think we got right to that level. And then this year, I think we deficit spent 536 or whatever it is. Okay, so these numbers, then you add these numbers. Well, these are always hugely negative. It's, I think historically, going back through these years, it's something like minus probably high 600 billion to 700 billion dollars. Okay, so and then the savings and investment numbers are a little bit harder, but they're a lot smaller. They're generally the numbers that I've seen, and I'm sure I'll get corrected on this, if not now, later, but the numbers I've seen has investment adding 1 to 200 billion, right? So when you look at these numbers, all you have to do is go out and find these numbers, and if those numbers are negative, if you add this equation up and they're negative, then the economy is losing money. And the only way to make up for it is through private sector debt. It was when we go out and we borrow and we artificially prop it up because we, the people, we have very real limitations on the amount of money we can borrow, and those limitations are our incomes. And of course, this gets back to questions of, paying people more, raising the minimum wage, those sorts of things. The more money people have, the more money they'll be able to consume. So I hope that helps. I would say think about balancing the economy and not the budget. The budget is really used by the government to balance the economy. Don't hate the trade deficit. The trade deficit represents real goods and services that are coming to us. When somebody says, we need to make more goods in America. No, we don't. Because we can't compete with China. Go online and look up Foxconn and look at working conditions at a place like Foxconn. It's a company that's the size of a city. It's got 1 million people. People share, 8 people to a room. They have nets around the building so people don't throw themselves off and kill themselves. That's how miserable it is. We can't compete with that. So we don't want to bring manufacturing back because the only way we can compete globally is to drive wages down, to drive working conditions down. We need to embrace the new paradigm, which is, automation is coming. I mean, that'll be a huge factor. Don't hate automation. Automation is nothing more than, in my opinion anyway, it is, that's the word I'm looking for. It's an augmentation to productivity. The more productivity we have, the more money we can create and circulate in our economy. So don't hate automation. Yes, it will displace jobs, but if the government does what it should, what we're talking about here, it should be able to create more money, and either through job guarantees or basic incomes, or people getting paid to do things that they like to do. Go plant, trees in a park, go draw some art. I mean, the government could pay people to do things that would make society better. And that's the reason we really need to embrace this is I see all of this as opportunity, right? If we could just understand it, we could realize the opportunity that is the amount of lost productivity. I mean, I didn't even really address that, but when productive capacity of the country is at 75%, there's productivity that we could be doing. There are people sitting at home right now who could be working. We're losing their productivity. That every day, and we can never get it back. We can never have it back. Even if we put everybody to work tomorrow, we still would have lost all that productivity between yesterday and 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years before. So we always want to be trying to get to that maximum level.
Chris, just speaking clearly, when we talk about productivity, we're not just talking about capitalism. We're talking about helping a mother, a single mother at home. We're talking about, teaching an art class or taking an art class or bettering society. We talk productivity. We're talking about doing things, not just like a grind to, for the man. We're talking about redefining work.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Believe me, if I could quit my job and do what I'm doing right now full time, I would. And would it make the world a better place? I'd like to think so. But I mean, let's say you're you today you toy in solar panel design, but your real job is as an accountant. Well, if that's your passion, then we could pay people to do the things that they're passionate about. And like you said, some of it is just helping your grandmother. Some of it is you know, emptying. I mean, when we were kids, there was a trash can in every park. Why isn't there one today? Because we're trying to save money. But when we save money like that, that's somebody's job. So, I mean, putting a trash can in every park and hiring somebody to empty it might sound like a simple thing, but that matters, right? The more we try to take out in order to save money, put simply, one person's spending is another person's income. So if you save money, you are taking income away from somebody in the quest to save money. The irony is what's good for the individual business is, I mean, this is somewhat of a paradox. What's good for an individual business can be bad for the economy, right? Saving money in a business by, say, I can do more work with fewer employees, right? I got this new machine. Well, we don't want you to do that. We want you to keep that employee and up the amount of demand, how much of your stuff you're demanding. We're demanding from you. So you have to keep it. And the only way that's going to happen is if everybody has more money. And the only way that's going to happen is if there's more money circulating in the economy and the government is part of that, right? Going back to that formula, right? It's all about, keeping the economy balanced, and the government has control of taxing and spending.
Chris, it was wonderful to have you on tonight. Thank you so much. I appreciate you say things differently, you do things a little differently, and it helps fill in the full picture. I really, really, really appreciate your friendship. I appreciate your wisdom, and I appreciate the vantage point you brought to our listeners and our viewers. So, Chris, I want to thank you from Real Progressives. Folks, I want to thank you all for coming to Real Progressives to hear this tonight. If you like what you see, please come to our YouTube page and follow us there. Select notifications, and you'll be able to see when our videos go live. If you like what we're doing, please donate to our Patreon account. It helps us to get equipment, helps us to fund different activities that we're doing to provide you the best coverage possible. And also, if you want to, please, we are looking for people that are willing to help us out keeping this place running. That includes live streamers, that includes people that are willing to do the behind the scenes stuff, like helping us upload videos to YouTube or sharing stuff from our website or sharing stuff from Facebook page, etc. It takes a village, trust me, this is a very, very heavy lift to keep Real Progressives going. So with that, Chris, I want to thank you once again. Folks, thank you for joining us. For Steve Grumbine with Real Progressives, have a great night, everybody.